Cuba and the United States have been at odds since Fidel Castro seized power in 1959. There has been some softening in U.S. policies towards Cuba since Castro formally transferred the Cuban presidency to his brother Raul, and Barack Obama became president in 2008. Even though all of the positive recent activity, is there any hope to repair the relations between the United States and Cuba? History between the two countries has been more than bitter, and today tension between the two has relaxed, but has enough time passed for the wounds to finally heal? To fully answer this question, let's look back at the two countries' history. In the midst of the Cold War, early 1960s, the ongoing state of frozen relations between the United States and Cuba is rooted in political and economic resentment that reached its climax. In 1959, Fidel Castro and a group of revolutionaries overthrew the government and President Fulgencio Batista. As the new Cuban regime began forming trade deals with the Soviet Union, the United States responded with escalating economic retaliation. U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower slashed the import quota for Cuban sugar, which was Cuba's chief industry. Washington banned nearly all exports to Cuba, which President John F. Kennedy expanded to a full economic embargo. That includes severe travel restrictions. By the early 1960s, the United States had severe diplomatic ties with Cuba and was pursuing covert operations to overthrow Castro's regime. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a botched CIA-backed attempt to topple the government, further inflamed the Cuban mistrust. This led to a secret agreement allowing the Soviet Union to build a missile base on the island. The United States discovered those plans on October 1962, setting off a 14-day standoff. U.S. ships imposed a naval quarantine around the island, and Kennedy demanded the destruction of the missile sites. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with an agreement that the missile sites would be dismantled if the United States pledged not to invade Cuba. Since the event of 1961 through 1962, economic restrictions and diplomatic isolation have been the major prongs of the U.S. policy towards Cuba, even after the Soviet Union's collapse. Washington strengthened the embargo with the 1992 Cuba Democracy Act and 1996 Helms-Burton Act. These acts state that the restriction may not be lifted until Cuba holds a free and fair elections and transitions to a democratic government that excludes the Castros. Therefore, Raul is scheduled to leave office in 2018. It also calls for the improvements in the human rights, including ensuring a free press and releasing political prisoners. Some adjustments have been made to the trade restrictions, however, so the U.S. medical supplies and agricultural products can be exported to the island under certain conditions. But the Cuban government estimates that more than 50 years of severe trade restrictions has resulted in a loss of approximately $1.126 trillion. The severe tensions caused by the past events has prevented healing between the two countries. The United States and Cuba do not have formal diplomatic relations, and tough approvals still remain in place, but contacts between the states are growing. Certain U.S. restrictions have loosened during Obama's presidency. The administration of George W. Bush strongly enforced the restrictions against Cuba and sharply lowered the cap on family payments from $3,000 to just $300 in 2004. Obama, however, reversed some of these policies during his first term and even went further, allowing U.S. citizens to send payments to non-family members in Cuba and to travel under license. Americans with families living in Cuba can travel freely now, and there is no cap on payments for them. Tensions are still high, but there are significant less tensions than the early 1960s. Finally, what is the consensus on healing relations between the U.S. and Cuba? Experts say normalization of relations is unlikely in the near future to medium term. Though we don't need an expert to tell us what we already know. We already know, of course, there is always hope in the future for the healing of Cuban and U.S. relations, but how far in the future is unknown. The continued imprisonment of the U.S. citizen Alan Gross, accused in 2009 of trying to destabilize the Cuban regime through a U.S.-sponsored program, and the detainment of Cuban nationals in the U.S. prisons remain significant sticking points in the relationship. Meanwhile, Raul Castro has gradually carried out major economic reforms and lifted the travel restrictions. Even though the history between the two countries has been undoubtedly tense, the restrictions have been relaxed as of late. Relations may not heal until the distant future, but there is hope. Thank you for watching. I hope this helps.